Welcome to another in the series of Perth US Asia Center Foreign Policy Conversations. As those of you who have followed the center for the last 6 years know, we have a particular focus on our near neighbors in what we call the Indo-Pacific. Those countries that are close to us: Indonesia, Thailand, India. But in recent years, we've had a particular focus and passion for the country of Vietnam. Not quite as close to Perth as Jakarta might be, but a dynamic country which has begun to impact not just ASEAN and Southeast Asia, the region in which Vietnam sits, but which has really impacted global views of the region in which we find ourselves. Vietnam is the last country that a member of our team, Kyle Springer, one of our research associates, visited right before the COVID-19 crackdown, and we've had several reports on it this year. So it's with particular delight that today's conversation is with Cat Thao Nguyen, a close friend and supporter of the center. Cat is co-founder and chair of the Australia-Vietnam Young Leadership Dialogue. She is a managing director of Global Ready LLC and a Lumina Learning partner, assisting clients with inclusive leadership, diversity, and belonging strategy. She's worked long in corporate law, private equity, international education. She was formerly chair of the board of Loreto Vietnam, formerly the managing head of AVYLD Vietnam, a director of the Australian Chamber of Commerce in Vietnam, on the national advisory board to the SBS here in Australia. Her memoir, We Are Here, was published by Allen and Irwin and was shortlisted for the 2016 New South Wales Premier's Literary Awards. And she's now in Ho Chi Minh City, been living back in Vietnam since 2007. On a somewhat parochial basis, we at the Perth US Asia Center remember her fondly for both being the inspiration for and one of the key delegates to our inaugural WA ASEAN Trade and Investment Dialogue just 2 years ago, and a kind supporter of us ever since then. So Kat, thank you for taking the time and joining us today. I appreciate it.
It's really fantastic to be with you, Gordon, and I have really fond memories of that experience with your organization, and also going to Perth for, I think it was like a 15-year hiatus, I think, before I went back to WA, but it was so phenomenal. And I think there is just a lot of potential between WA and Vietnam and ASEAN.
Well, we had intended to bring you back this year. We are going to continue our annual WA ASEAN Trade and Investment Dialogue, but it's going to have to be virtual in the COVID-19 era. But we will look forward to a moment when the borders are dropped and we can resume kind of direct contacts and make sure that it's not another 15 years before we get you back to the WA.
Indeed.
Before we launch into more weighty matters, I want to start out with a more controversial question. I noted it in several other previous bios with you that you're passionate about fish sauce. And so I'm going to just jump right in with the hard question. If you're an average Aussie and all you know is, and again, apologies to the Thai, the kind of cheap squid brand fish sauce that you can find on the shelves of Woolies or Coles, you know, what is the next step up if you want to upgrade? Should we be going to Viet Huong 3 crab, or, you know, what should we be looking for if we want to join you and among the connoisseurs of the fine levels of fish sauce?
Well, you know, fish sauce is, if you did read somewhere that I really love fish sauce and Shiraz. So Australian Shiraz and Vietnamese fish sauce. So that's, well, maybe together at the same time could be a very interesting combination. But, you know, it's a bit difficult for Australians because the fish sauce that I use is in Vietnam and it's not exported to Australia yet. So, you know, it's a 100-year-old company and they've been making it a traditional way. So I won't tease you with the brand, but I think if you're in Australia, Viet Hung is the next best thing. It's mass, but it's very good, you know. Wow. So there you go. There's my tip for the day.
Well, you entice us to come to Vietnam to try the good stuff, as you will.
Yes.
Well, look, Vietnam is really an interesting case. Other countries, Japan, Korea, Singapore, especially Taiwan, have gotten a lot of attention for their COVID-19 responses. A country that hasn't got nearly as much attention and yet has had a tremendous response has been Vietnam. Up until last month, it had gone through the entire pandemic without having a single fatality. Unfortunately, there's been a relatively small outbreak recently, but Vietnam has been quite competent not only in its management of the COVID-19 pandemic, but the economic impacts as well. I was wondering if you might just start off by giving us kind of big picture. You're sitting there in Ho Chi Minh City, you're involved in the business community. Obviously, like it is in every other country around the world, the social, health, and economic impacts of the COVID-19 virus are got to be front and center on your mind and that of your colleagues as well. Would you help our audience understand how Vietnam has handled it and what the broader implications are for Vietnam's economy, its trade, its engagement with the region?
Well, I am a little bit disappointed that globally Vietnam didn't get as much coverage as it should have. You know, for a country that borders China with 96 million people, and even up until the second outbreak, which happened, you know, within the last month or so, Vietnam has less than 1,000 infections, right? So, I mean, I think that is quite phenomenal, and you know, the deaths are less than 25, you know. So, but in the first wave, no deaths, only a few hundred cases. Now, I think, you know, as the World Bank described Vietnam's response, it acted rapidly and boldly. So very quickly on, it shut down its borders, it closed all the schools, and the lockdown as a subsequence was only 22 days. Okay, so even in this second wave, we haven't had a national lockdown like the first time. So the implicate and the way that the Vietnamese government handled it, I think, was quite coordinated. It does have a lot of infrastructure in order to support the contact tracing, but it has adopted technology very, very quickly. So, you know, at the moment, it's got a Blue Zone app. So the app is called Blue Zone, and almost all the citizens have downloaded it, and the app will basically notify you if you are close and level 1, 2, or 3, or 4 to a place where someone has been infected. So then you basically self-isolate. So I think it was very rigorous in terms of the approach, and also the sentiment of the Vietnamese people is very collectivist, and so people, you know, would feel shame if they would cause burden to the community in preference for their own rights. So I think that's something that's also a distinguishing difference with some of the other countries. But because the Vietnamese adopted technology, they responded not with complacence. They were very, you know, proactive. I think it has had still negative effects for the economy, but it has been sheltered to some extent. Because Vietnam opened up pretty much early on while everyone was in lockdown, it was able to still export. Okay, so compared to its competitors, for example, if you look at the shrimp and aquaculture industries, you know, its competitors are Ecuador, you know, other countries that were in complete lockdown. So Vietnam was able to actually gain. So even though the growth for Vietnam has been the lowest in 30 years, it's still, you know, registered about 3.8% growth in the first few months of the year. Yeah, and also, you know, while its borders were locked down, the Vietnamese government has allowed, you know, foreign experts to come in, so engineers, you know, and the like, in order to ensure that foreign invested manufacturing operations and other essential operations for export will be uninterrupted. So whilst the supply chain, raw materials and so forth, you know, around the world has disrupted Vietnam's exports, it's still been able to, its complete negative effects have been mitigated to some extent. The other driver also is that Vietnam's rising middle class is very robust. It's the fastest growing middle class in Southeast Asia. And because domestic consumption accounts for about 60% to 62% of the entire GDP, while we were in lockdown and our borders have sort of relatively been closed, it's domestic consumption that's been driving the economy. And out of the, you know, 60% of GDP that is domestic consumption, 42% is essential goods. So 42% is spent on essential goods and services. So the discretionary spend is only about 20-something%. So, you know, that has also helped Vietnam to sort of be, you know, not as devastated. Certainly, there are certain industry sectors such as tourism, which is really devastated in hospitality. But I think overall, it's riding this pandemic quite well.
You know, even before COVID-19, I think for those Australians who understood the need for the country to diversify its trading relationships and its markets, and the potential source of investment, Vietnam was a remarkable, country of focus. The fact that they've got a population almost 4 times that of ours, the fact that there are these longstanding ties, has meant that inevitably we need to be looking at, as you pointed out, the country in Southeast Asia with the largest and rather the fastest growing middle class. And so I wonder if I might take a step back and look a little bit more specifically at the Australia-Vietnam relationship. Through your work with the Australia-Vietnam Young Leadership Dialogue, you've been thinking, I think, probably bigger picture about that relationship itself. But it's a really interesting one. Australia as a country is and defines itself as a nation of immigrants. And much of its success historically and certainly today has been built on the efforts and the innovations and the relationships that immigrants have brought to our shores here. But Vietnam has a unique place even in the history of migrants. I think you may recall from our previous conversation, my wife is from Laos, the next door neighbor to Vietnam. She similarly, due to the disruption of the Vietnam War era, eventually went to the United States as a refugee, where I met her there before our own migration here to Australia. But what we encountered here when we arrived 7 years ago is a country which had in fundamental ways been transformed by Vietnamese migration in a way that it wasn't by British or European migration, because in some ways it was the Vietnamese migration that forced the country rather to come to face with its racist history, with the White Australia policy, and that led to the more successful subsequent waves that we're seeing today from China, from other countries in Southeast Asia. So I'm wondering if you might, again, I realize you've written books on this and it's hard to ask you to summarize this in a short question, but give us kind of your broad assessment of the Australia-Vietnam relationship, the people-to-people ties in particular, and then where you think the real potential is for that relationship in particular to go forward.
Thanks for the question, Gordon, and also the context as well. You're right. The early Vietnamese community diaspora in Australia, I think the critical mass was really because of the refugees that came after the war. And you're right. It did force Australia to reckon within itself. And you look at some of the debates in Parliament around that time, in terms of what they were viewing as our obligations in Australia and these people and the war that we were involved with. We were the boat people. We arrived in droves, although my family actually went by foot across the killing fields of Cambodia. So we crossed 2 borders through Cambodia, Vietnam, through the jungles, through the mass graves, and through the most mined landmass in the history of the world. So that was a border between Thailand and Cambodia, and we only lost 1 person, and we managed to arrive in a refugee camp in Thailand, and then we got to Australia. So our route actually meant that for those who went in that way, there was only a 10% survival rate. For those that went by boat, there was a 50% survival rate. And so, when we think about this context, and we know now, everywhere we go, and there's the Vietnamese restaurants or the nail, the pedicures and what have you. And we look at this, we take it for granted in terms of, the Vietnamese presence in Australia, but there also wasn't without teething. So there was a certain time period where in Australia, there was a lot of, organized crime and violence, and people sort of forget that and just sort of think, okay, here's this sort of fantastic contribution that the Vietnamese have made. And so I think it's really symbolic of a bilateral relationship, you know, symbolic in that, you know, you have to tease together, you have to grow together, and you have to get to a point where a healthy functioning relationship is not extraction. So I think, you know, immature relationships look at how do I actually get something from that other country, right? And then we move to from extraction to trade and transactions. So it's what do I have to sell to you and what do you have to sell to me? But I think a more mature and nuanced and successful relationship is co-creation and collaboration. And this is where we can see, okay, how do we actually create together solutions for the shared problems that we actually have within our particular region and also subsequently for the world? So I think Vietnam and Australia has excellent foundations. It really does. We were one of the first countries to actually normalize our relations with Vietnam actually before the end of the war. So this was in 1973. So the war ended in 1975. And during the US trade embargo, Australia actually approved aid support for Vietnam, which it desperately needed. You know, people were starving during that time. And in 1993, ANZ was one of the first banks to actually obtain a license to operate in Vietnam. And in 2012, Australia was actually the largest provider of aid finance to Vietnam, and it has built critically important bridges and infrastructure in Vietnam. And, you know, there's a bridge in the Mekong Delta called the Mae Thuong Bridge. It's called the Australia Bridge by the locals. And my illiterate grandmother even knew that it was the Australia Bridge. But yet, you know, in 2017, 3 years ago, ANZ, you know, signs were replaced by Korea's Shinhan Bank signs, you know, when Shinhan Bank purchased the retail arm. The Commonwealth Bank also closed its branch in Vietnam. It used to actually have an innovation hub in Vietnam servicing the rest of the world, including South Africa, creating products for Indonesia. Now that's also closed as well. So, you know, when you look at two-way trade in Vietnam, it is still actually relatively low, you know, like compared to New Zealand with a country of 5 million, we have more trade, you know, with New Zealand than with Vietnam. And so I think, you know, there is a lot of capacity. And I think that diplomatically, I think we are at an incredible stage. You know, Vietnam signed a strategic partnership with Australia, the highest level of diplomatic relationship between two nations. But I think to be really honest, the Japanese and the Koreans have holistically engaged with Vietnam very well. So they have very early on moved on the continuum of the relationship beyond extraction and trade. They have moved with soft power engagement very, very well, and education and culture and trade and investment and loans and a whole bunch of things, but it was really strategic and holistic and coordinated. So what is the result of that? The result of that is Vietnamese are studying in Japan more and more than Australia. When you look at online learning platforms, where you look at short courses like Coursera, for example, the top searches are Japanese language and Korean language, right? So, you know, the benefits are so much more multifaceted. And I think there is a lot more opportunity for Australia to engage with Vietnam. On that particular note, I'd like to sort of speak a little bit about the people-to-people links through the Australia-Vietnam Young Leadership Dialogue. So this is a platform where we are getting together exceptional young leaders between 25 and 35 to come together on a transformative journey. And this looks at leadership, it looks at courage, it looks at sustainability, what does it mean to be a leader in our region. And it really is about that third wave of a healthy relationship, about co-creation. And we are so proud that Sir Peter Cosgrove, the esteemed Sir Peter Cosgrove, is our patron. So he recognizes that the future of the bilateral relationship is with these types of incredible visionary young people.
And Peter had a relatively recent visit to Vietnam, didn't he? Wasn't he there just last year?
Yes, when he was still Governor General, he came to Vietnam and was incredibly received by the people and the government there. He, as was very significant in the peacekeeping efforts in East Timor, and at the time when he visited, Vietnam was sending its first ever peacekeeping contingent abroad to South Sudan to deploy a military hospital. And it was really moving. I was actually the project manager for the English language component, which was funded by the Australian government. So it was really moving, being on the tarmac at this, airport, which was formerly a war-ravaged airport, a country that was receiving aid from the rest of the world and now contributing to peace. And so Sir Peter Cosgrove addressed the group, which included men and women and doctors and nurses from the military hospital in South Vietnam, and was incredibly inspiring. But it was a really moving moment.
Kat, I appreciate your framing of the co-creation phase of an economic relationship, and obviously your own trajectory from a childhood in Western Sydney to being back in Vietnam now, training and helping, assisting others, and in many cases representing Australia in that same regard is one example of that. However, I also detected a bit of dismay, frustration in your remarks in the failure of Australian business writ large to invest to the degree they should be. Right? And again, that would track with our own experience at the Perth US Asia Centers. 6 years of calling for the nation's business community to diversify has resulted in an economy which is less diverse before. It's hard to get companies not to kind of chase the levels of gold that are in China and the expectations in China, and they're missing out on kind of the other opportunities that are there. You mentioned the decision of ANZ and Commonwealth Bank to sell out. It all leads me to a conclusion, which I'll test whether you agree with it or not, and then maybe get your reaction to it. And that the next phase of co-creation is much more likely to be driven by that rising, dynamic, young, energetic community in Vietnam than it is the much smaller community we have here in Australia. In other words, if you look at your Vietnamese counterparts that are active participating with you in the Australia-Vietnam Young Leadership Dialogue, my guess is they're the ones who are looking out for partnerships, et cetera. And our challenge is just to entice them away from Korea and away from Japan. And let me note here, just as an aside, I really appreciate your bringing up Korea and Japan, because one of the narratives we hear so often here in Australia when it comes to ASEAN is it's too hard, it's too complex, there's too many cultures, there's corruption, the ease of doing business is difficult. And my reaction is, well, somehow the Koreans have figured it out, the Japanese have figured it out. What is it that we can't do in that process? So anyway, let me just get your reaction to that, but in particular to my own sentiment that what we really need to be doing is identifying and enticing, leaders on that side to come here to engage with us there, because they're the ones with a lot of the drive initiative and the numbers.
Yeah, really interesting point, Gordon. On the first one, though, when you talked about diversification and Australia now during COVID really sort of realizing that we have been far too reliant, on say, for example, China, right? You look at different different sort of indices that look at how integrated or how reliant are we on China, especially in strategic areas. We're reliant on China for 595 categories of goods and 167 in critical national infrastructure, according to the Henry Jackson Society. And although China is Vietnam's largest trading partner. It accounts for 22%, of Vietnam's basically trade. But I think Vietnam has been very strategic in how it engages with other partners. The US is second, by the way. So, the manifestations of the tensions, Vietnam is absolutely caught in the middle. So I think that, your hypothesis or proposition that the Vietnamese young people or young leaders have a greater propensity to sort of, be fueling the relationship, I think is accurate, Gordon. I think it's absolutely accurate. And I think it's also, it's because of a few things. One thing I have observed is that because Vietnam has been a developing economy, and the young people who have needed to look outwards, have not looked outwards with a sense of complacency, right? So this is a country where their parents had experienced, starvation and so forth, even though, 65% of the population are under 30 or 35, and they don't remember any of that. There is sort of, those legacies. So when they look outwards and engage outwards, it is with a sense of drive and hunger and entrepreneurial spirit. And it is to look outwards in a very broad sense. So they have looked outwards west, they've looked outwards north, east, south, right? So when you look at international students, the private fee paying, yes, have gone west, but the scholarship students have for a long time gone to Thailand, gone to China, gone to Japan to study on scholarship. But when you look at sort of the equivalent in Australia, when we look outwards, we look west. We have only looked west. And we look to the US, we look to the UK, we look to, the countries that we have traditionally for dominant cultures aligned with. Right now, Australia is a very multicultural nation, but I don't think it is the most successful multicultural nation in the world. And we still have dominant cultural norms that lure and seduce our businesses, seduce our young people, when they decide to travel and explore. And so for groundbreaking programs like the New Colombo Plan, that is trying to encourage young students at university to sort of spend time abroad, it still is difficult for us to get students who are interested in Vietnam. And yet, if you look at the data, Vietnam is the potential for us to diversify. It has all of the, I guess, key tenets that will make it a dragon and make it an incredible, country in its own right in the next 10 years.
Well, I think both the challenge posed by those dominant cultural norms that you just addressed and the potential that is inherent in Vietnam underlines what you were introducing to us just a minute earlier, which is the work of the Australia-Vietnam Young Leadership Dialogue. And I'm wondering if you might address the work of the dialogue in this current time, because obviously we're not able to entice you down to Perth. International travel is limited. How are you keeping those people-to-people ties alive in this era? And particularly, how are you continuing to inspire that rising generation to be able to challenge those dominant cultural norms that you were talking about?
Well, the short answer it's very difficult, Gordon, as you are finding with your own organization as well. But I think, what's really important is to always go back to why you were established. So we are in a process of creating a strategy for the next 5+ years. And so Peter Cosgrove has joined us in our last board meeting and helping to help shape that strategy, which we will make public in the near future. But when we articulated very clearly our vision and our mission, it is very simple. So our vision is to advance sustainable prosperity through a deeper Australia-Vietnam bilateral relationship. And our mission is to create, ignite, and nurture a network of exceptional young leaders from Australia and Vietnam to accelerate efforts towards the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So we measure our success by our impact through these young leaders and collaborative efforts and co-creation against these global goals which impact all of humanity, right? So what we do is every 2 years through a dialogue, a face-to-face, it was a face-to-face dialogue, we bring these exceptional young leaders together and we orient them and we ignite within them a sense of purpose, which is beyond anything that they have thought before, we believe. And so, and then we create a platform, and in our ultimate goal to create an ecosystem whereby not just the delegates and the alumni, but all the stakeholders who touch our organization, from sponsors to speakers and community organizations, we create an ecosystem whereby that co-creation is possible, and the co-creation is towards the Sustainable Development Goals. And I have to say, the people that we have come across as the delegates of the organization has been absolutely phenomenal. I mean, there are a few people that I'd mentioned that are alumni. So we have 2,000 expressions of interest, but we only choose 10 to represent each country. So the filtering process is incredibly difficult and robust, and we involve the ambassadors in selection and a whole bunch of people. But from Vietnam, these people are, for example, has 35,000 staff. One CEO, he's 35,000 staff, has been involved in the first privatization of any airport in Vietnam. These are critical infrastructure projects. One person is the youngest property developer in Vietnam and a partner to JW Marriott and Four Points Sheraton. So she develops those real estate projects. Another is manages an impact investment fund that is one of 3 active funds in Vietnam in that space. And we have entrepreneurs, startups, storytellers. So these are people with incredible influence and incredible vision. So we are harnessing them towards a deeper bilateral relationship for the benefit of a common good. And I think, going back to your earlier point, Gordon, you are absolutely right. It is with these young people who don't possibly have a lot of the burdens or the norms that have limited their risk appetite. Okay, and so from the Australia side, we have incredible young Australians under 35, so they are very established in their own right, in a whole bunch of different sectors, from private equity to conservation. And it's really good because we have filtered those who already have a demonstrated interest in Vietnam. So I think for us, rather than mass trying to sort of get people interested in Vietnam, we already, because of our organization, we have people who would naturally come into the ecosystem, and then we just create opportunities for them to deepen that interest and therefore to accelerate the meaning of the bilateral relationship.
Well, listening to your inspiring description, I would just think of 2 quick conclusions. Number one, obviously, I hope that the next dialogue can be held in person again as soon as possible, because I can see the value of that. And given the caliber of the participants, I can see that we in WA need to make every effort to try to entice you to hold one of your dialogues here in Perth.
We would love that. We would absolutely love that. Let's talk to your state government.
Well, as you mentioned, one of the focuses of the center for the last 3 years has been to support the state government's Asian engagement strategy. And so you were kind enough to join us 2 years ago for the inaugural WA ASEAN Trade and Investment Dialogue, and your remarks were inspirational then. Last year we had a larger event still, and we had planned for an even larger event this year. It will be different. It'll be virtual. But our hope really is to inspire not just the state government, but businesses from the state. Already, the Perth airport is exploring opportunities for direct flights with Vietnam, which would make a tremendous difference for students, for tourists, for investors, etc. But I wonder if I might end there. If we're looking here in Western Australia, people are, as you rightly point out, far more receptive to the diversify mantra or requirement than they were before. And they're needing to understand the potential that is in Vietnam. So it's not viewed just historically, but in terms of where the country is going, the demographics, the middle class, the economic growth. Are there a couple of sectors where you think that people should be paying particular attention to in Vietnam? Are there individual success stories that would inspire the community here in WA to give greater priority to or to pay closer attention to Vietnam than they are currently?
I think that it's really fantastic that the demographics as such and the proximity of WA to Asia make it possibly more open, to engagement. And also the time zones is a really critical factor, really. So I think there are a couple of things, sectors. Now, agriculture is still a very large, important base for the Vietnamese economy, even though it doesn't feature in the top 10 exports for the people. Yeah, it doesn't actually feature in top 10 exports. For the people, agriculture is incredibly important. Okay. Now, there is a lot of innovation happening in Vietnam in agriculture technology. So I think for WA and Australia, we have very shared concerns. The shared concerns are water, managing, salination, managing water resources. And climate change is a massive reality in Vietnam. We, I think, don't have the issues or the politics around, climate change. For us, we know in reality, and also according to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that the Mekong Delta, which is home to millions and millions of residents, is the third most impacted delta in the world by climate change. And we are seeing all of the changes happening right now and affecting so many people and industries. So the government has oriented, especially in agriculture, to support the development of agriculture technology. And there is one particular interesting example of co-creation. So the University of Technology, Sydney, came to Vietnam and created a joint research centre. It's the first joint research centre of its kind for Australia in Vietnam. And it subsequently has developed another one, so it has two. So they are doing research in agriculture, they're doing research in cyber, they're doing research around pollution, around shared concerns, and it is really interesting. So that was through people-to-people links, but also through institutional support and formal support. And so, the products of that is then going to benefit both nations. And I think that I actually authored a report commissioned by the Department of Education and Training from Australia called Inspired Potential. And that report was around research and innovation partnerships between Australia and Vietnam. I can provide you that link later on. But those detailed case studies that are very practical and that look at principles of engagement that can lead to sort of shared innovation. So, Vietnam, in terms of energy resources, is making structural changes. So it has put targets for renewables, to be a very important part of energy use in Vietnam. And actually in 2017, solar was non-existent. But by the end of 2019, Vietnam has the largest share of solar installed capacity in Southeast Asia. So it has 44%. It surpassed Thailand and Malaysia. So within 2 years, it put the infrastructure in place, it put the feed-in tariffs, it put in the system, the loans, beneficial financing, and so it is moving very fast. So I hope that your viewers will understand that Vietnam is not a developing lagged economy. It is rapidly moving, entrepreneurial, incredible ideas, and really it's only about the nations or the states who are savvy enough in order to pivot towards Vietnam that will reap common benefits.
Wonderfully put, and it fully comports with my own multiple trips to Vietnam, where the number one impression I came away with was just inspiration in the youth, the energy, the vigor with which they're approaching the world. If we in Western Australia, or Australia as a country, approach Vietnam as a country where we can just sell something, we're missing the picture. It really is what we're calling the co-creative relationship. It is the dynamism that exists there. And so really what we need to be doing is enticing them to come here and work more with us. But that requires us to be inspired. And I'm confident that after a conversation like this, many of our viewers will take a much closer look at Vietnam and hopefully engage as quickly as possible following this COVID-19 pandemic. Now, Cat, from my own lived experience, I know that the cheap Thai brand squid fish sauce is about $2 to $3 in the supermarket. The better Vietnamese at Viet Huong, 3 crab brand is about $7 to $8 in the supermarket. This conversation was a not yet available in Australia, priceless, 100-year-old family recipe, only available in Vietnam conversation. And I'm delighted that we have it virtually to share with our community. Thank you so much for your time and for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. And I'm looking forward, to seeing as many people, you especially, Gordon, in Vietnam when the borders open, and look forward to further deeper engagement. Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it.